Why Tibetan DNA is so unique. The genetic secret to breathing at 15,000 feet. The midwife doesn't rush. She counts the baby's breaths, thin air, steady hands, a mother who isn't gasping. The first cry lands clear, like a bell. For most of us, this altitude is a trap. Headaches, foggy thinking, blood turning to sludge. But here, life goes on. Today we're unraveling the mystery, how a gene called EPAS1 helps Tibetans avoid overproducing red blood cells. And the shocking truth, the clue came from a tiny bone in a Siberian cave. Tibetans at altitude don't crank up hemoglobin the way Andean communities do. Their blood stays thinner. They breathe more per minute. Their blood vessels stay wider. Measured nitric oxide is higher, which keeps the flow smooth. For lowlanders, the default acclimatization is a trap. The body pours red cells into circulation, hematocrit rises, and the blood thickens. Headaches become warnings. The risk of clots and stroke climbs. You feel stronger, then suddenly worse. Think about your body's oxygen alarm, a built-in system that notices low oxygen and calls for action. For most people, that alarm shouts, breathe harder, make more red cells, squeeze vessels. In Tibetans, the alarm sounds different. Breathing and vessel responses do the heavy lifting. The red cell factory stays quiet. Same mountain, different strategy. Researchers measured this in real homes at altitude. Cynthia Beale tracked oxygen use and hemoglobin. Tatum Simonson's work mapped genetic and physiological signatures. The pattern held. Tibetans maintain near-normal hemoglobin, with fewer cases of chronic mountain sickness than groups using the red cell solution. The midwife doesn't quote studies. She knows the outcome. Most babies pink up fast. Mothers stay stable. To understand why this community doesn't flip the dangerous switch, we need to ask a stranger question. Why does a gene in Tibetans look oddly familiar, like a borrowed tool? The answer begins with a tiny fragment of bone discovered in a cold Siberian cave. The borrowed tool, Denisovan DNA and the EPAS1 switch. In the Altai Mountains, inside Denisova Cave, archaeologists found a pinky bone no bigger than a grape. Ancient DNA pulled from that fragment revealed a vanished cousin, Denisovans, not Neanderthals, not us, a nearby branch. That tiny bone became a genetic time capsule, a reference we didn't know we needed. This should have been impossible. When researchers compared Tibetan genomes to neighboring lowlanders, a stretch near a gene called EPAS1 didn't match the usual patterns. In 2014, Emilia Huerta Sanchez and colleagues reported a striking signal, a Tibetan haplotype around EPAS1 that looked much closer to the Denisovan sequence than to other modern humans. Not identical, but unmistakably related. The implication was bold. An ancient introgression event had delivered a tool that later became critical at altitude. So, what does EPAS1 do? It helps run the oxygen alarm. Inside cells, when oxygen drops, a pathway often called HIF, hypoxia-inducible factors, adjusts the body's response. EPAS1 encodes a key player in that network, HIF2A. For most of us at altitude, the alarm flips the red blood cell lever hard. Hemoglobin climbs, blood thickens, oxygen delivery stalls in the sludge. In Tibetans, with the Denisovan-like EPAS1 haplotype, that lever is tuned down. The alarm still boosts breathing, vessels still relax, but the red cell factory doesn't spin out of control. Think of it like a wrench designed for thin air. At sea level, it sits quietly in the drawer. At 15,000 feet, it's the exact fit. The midwife has never heard the name EPAS1, but its downstream effects show up in her work. Fewer low birth weight babies than lowland newcomers at the same altitude. EPAS1 doesn't act alone, but it's strongly linked to this pattern. Fewer mothers slipping into crises linked to thick blood. Calm rooms where they used to brace for chaos. Here's the part that shocked scientists. The selection signal around EPAS1 in Tibetans is among the strongest in our species. If you run the population genetics, the most intense phase likely unfolded in the last 3 to 8,000 years, just a few hundred generations. That's fast in human terms. It makes sense though. Once families lived year-round on the plateau, pregnancies happened in thin air, and pastoral work demanded steady exertion. A tuned alarm meant more surviving infants and fewer maternal complications. Tiny advantages compound. Now, what's interesting is that high-altitude peoples didn't all solve the same problem the same way. Andean communities often rely on higher hemoglobin, a workable but risky compromise that ties to chronic mountain sickness in older adults. Highland Ethiopians show efficient oxygen use with different genetic variants, not the Denisovan-like EPAS1 haplotype. Same pressure, different genetic roots, convergent evolution in real time, unfolding over a few hundred generations. If you're wondering about evidence beyond genetics, field studies help complete the picture. Simonson's work linked genetic variation to measured hemoglobin and oxygen saturation. Beale and collaborators documented ventilatory patterns and nitric oxide differences in everyday life, not just in labs. It's a collage: genes, physiology, and survival. Speed of selection. How the plateau chose winners. Selection didn't whisper on the plateau. It sorted lives. Year-round altitude meant pregnancies, fevers, and hard work all happened under thin air. Tiny physiological edges, clearer heads, steadier blood, turned into survival differences that echoed through families. Here's the part that shocked scientists. When teams modeled the genetics, the EPAS1 pattern stood out, a textbook case of rapid evolution in humans. The steepest climb likely happened in the last 3 to 8,000 years. Fast in evolutionary terms, not tens of thousands. That's not a glacier's pace. That's a landslide. Why so fast? Because the environment kept asking the same question every hour. Can your blood move oxygen without turning to sludge? The midwife saw the answer in outcomes. Her grandmother told stories of dangerous labors and babies who never cried. She sees fewer of those. Not none. Altitude is still hard, but fewer. Meanwhile, her brother carries salt along a ridge at an even cadence. He adjusts breathing, not blood thickness. That difference is quiet in a clinic. It's loud over a lifetime. Now here's where things get more interesting. Culture amplified the genetic signal. Pastoralism tethered families to high valleys. Better tents and cold season grazing kept them put through winters. Trade turned footpaths into corridors. When people stayed, the pressure stayed. Genes that tuned the oxygen alarm toward ventilation and vessel dilation paid off, generation after generation. And because the Denisovan-like EPAS1 was already in the deck, selection didn't need to invent a new part, just promote the right one. There was one problem for anyone hoping for a single switch story. Not every Tibetan carries the same haplotype, and EPAS1 doesn't act alone. Partners like EGLN1 and networks touching nitric oxide, ventilation control, and capillary growth contribute. Diet, infection history, and cold stress all shape the final picture. The lesson isn't one gene solved it. It's one region carried a decisive lever at altitude, part of a cluster of changes that seem to protect pregnancies and performance in thin air. Compare that to other highlands. Andean communities often push hemoglobin higher as their baseline trade-off. It works for many, but chronic mountain sickness is more common in older adults. Ethiopians at similar heights show efficiency with different variants, not the Denisovan-like EPAS1. Same question, different answers. Convergent evolution. routed through local histories. And this is where it gets personal. The same oxygen alarms that decide which newborns thrive at 15,000 feet are the alarms clinicians try to manage in emergency rooms and ICUs at sea level. The plateau's solution, keep blood moving, avoid sludge, offers a living model for how to protect the brain, the heart, and a fetus when oxygen falls. What it means for you. Medicine, limits, and open questions. ICU teams fight hypoxia every day. The Tibetan pattern shows a principle you can use. Let air and flow do the work, and avoid pushing red cell production into the danger zone. Researchers are still translating these insights into clinical practice. It doesn't mean ICUs literally copy Tibetans, but it supports strategies that favor airflow and blood flow over simply boosting red cells. When oxygen drops, thicker blood can stall delivery, like traffic piling up at a narrowed bridge. The plateau solution keeps the lanes open. In obstetrics, that matters. Studies of Tibetan lineages show wider uterine arteries and fewer low birth weight babies than lowland newcomers at the same altitude. EPAS1 doesn't act alone, but it's strongly linked to this pattern. It points to a conceptual strategy. Support ventilation and vessel tone so oxygen reaches the placenta without turning maternal blood syrupy. For stroke and critical care, the takeaway is similar. Thin blood moves. Overstimulating erythropoiesis in prolonged hypoxia can create problems you can't solve with one transfusion. Research tied to EPAS1 and partners like EGLN1 correlates with hemoglobin levels and risk for chronic mountain sickness. That map suggests targets, ways to modulate the oxygen alarm pharmacologically or through ventilatory management. This is emerging research, not a protocol. You're not editing genes. You're borrowing a play from a working human blueprint. Now, a boundary you need to know. You can't train your way into being Tibetan. Acclimatization helps. More breaths per minute, expanded plasma volume, better performance. But it doesn't rewrite the EPAS1 region. Lowlanders still tend to overproduce red cells with time at altitude. Athletes learn to respect that limit. So should climbers and clinicians. What's next? Beyond EPAS1 lies a network. Nitric oxide pathways, capillary growth, ventilatory control, maybe even microbiome and cold stress interactions. Simonson's physiological genetic links, Beal's field measurements, and the Huerta-Sanchez selection signal give medicine a focused set of levers, more air in, steady vessels, less sludge. Researchers are still connecting these dots. The midwife would describe it more simply. A calm mother, a baby who pinks up fast, a quiet room. Caution matters. Genes aren't destiny, and ancestry isn't a prescription. Adaptation is local, respect is universal. Learn the principle, reject the hierarchy. A ghost cousin left a tuned switch in our oxygen alarm. On the plateau, it meant calmer births and clearer heads. At sea level, it's a blueprint. And this isn't the only time ancient DNA has rewritten our survival story. Which adaptation do you want us to explore next? If you want more ancient DNA stories reshaping modern medicine, hit like. For deep dives into human adaptation, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's next.